Hello, everyone, and welcome to the start of Unit 8, our last unit of the year. Today, we are going to talk about the book that we're going to be reading for this unit, the novel Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. We'll get some background information on the author, the book, and the historical context, and we'll talk about some of the topics that we'll be looking at throughout this book. So this is a picture of John Steinbeck here with a background of some of the many, many books that he wrote. Most of his most famous books, including Of Mice and Men, were written in the 1930s, so about 90 years ago. And he lived, worked, and mostly wrote about California, where he, again, spent most of his time, especially this area called the Salinas Valley. So, who is John Steinbeck? So, John Steinbeck was born in 1902 and lived until 1968. Again, he lived in and wrote about California, specifically the Salinas River Valley. He was writing about his authentic experiences. Now, Of Mice and Men, the book we're reading, is fiction. It is not a true story. But like Moon of the Crusted Snow, like Moonlight Shadow, like a number of works we've read this year, it is realistic fiction. So even though the characters and specific events are made up, it is still based off of real experiences. Steinbeck, throughout his books, tended to write about people who often weren't featured in stories, specifically the poor, the struggling, and the reality of the times. He didn't sugarcoat things. He didn't try to create this fantasy or this amazing epic story of heroes and villains. He wanted to write about the people and communities that he saw with his own eyes, many of whom often just didn't make it into stories. Some of his most well-known books are Tortilla Flat, Of Mice and Men, and The Grapes of Wrath. But he actually wrote 27 books in his life. He's a very prolific author, and in particular has become famous for being one of the best authors at capturing, again, the reality of what America was like, especially in the 1930s. Eventually, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1962. Now, in order to understand his writing, we need to understand a couple aspects of the historical context. The most important is the Great Depression. You may have heard about this in history class. The Great Depression, the name is not talking about people being very sad, although that was certainly part of it. Depression here is an economic term, and it is referring to the most severe economic downturn in American history. It started in 1929 with a stock market crash, and it continued through most of the 1930s, the same period that Steinbeck is writing about, and the same period where our novel was published. It lasted until American involvement in World War II in the late 1930s spurred the economy. During the Great Depression, this 8-ish years, unemployment rates rose to 30%. So almost 1 in 3 people could not find a job. That is an absurdly high number. Even worse, by some measures, 50% of commercial banks failed. Now, what that means is that half of the banks in the entire country went bankrupt. They shut down. So there would be lines of people waiting outside banks to try to withdraw money that was their money that they had put in these banks, and the banks did not have money to give them. So all this money was lost. The impact of the Great Depression was widespread, but it hit farmers particularly hard because, in addition to all of this, crop prices fell by 50%. So things were selling for way less. Not only was it harder to find buyers with the rule of supply and demand, but it became unfeasible for a lot of bigger farms to hire and employ people. They couldn't afford to pay people when the crops were selling for so little. So this overproduction led to unemployment. There were tons of crops, but employers wouldn't hire people because they couldn't afford to do it. The overall impact of this was devastating. Hunger, despair, poverty, and homelessness. Millions of Americans had their lives destroyed, and the effects were felt around the world as well, though we are focusing on America for this book. My slides don't want to continue. There we go. So that brings us to our specific book of Mice and Men. There are three major issues that the novel deals with that we will be looking at. Firstly, the exploitation of itinerant or migrant workers. These are workers who migrate, who travel from place to place. They have no kind of set home, and that makes them much more vulnerable to being taken advantage of because they don't have community, they don't have connections. We'll also be looking at the failure of the American dream. This idea that America is the land of hope and promise, confronted with the reality of so many people losing hope, losing their jobs, losing their livelihoods. And more symbolically, I suppose, metaphorically, America's general moral decline, the feeling that America was losing sight of its values and focusing just on profit and survivability. Remember, the book was published in 1937, so again, almost 90 years ago. And even though it is written in and about this very specific time, all of these issues are ones that are still relevant today. They take different forms, but you'll recognize a lot of our modern world in what we are looking at here. I will say, especially with what happened earlier this year with ice in Minnesota, a lot of the issues with that overlap with this idea of the exploitation of migrant workers. Those same groups are most vulnerable and most likely to be harmed. So we'll definitely see some parallels there. If you remember, way back in our poetry unit, one poem that we looked at for poetry analysis was this one by Scottish poet Robert Burns called To a Mouse. And we looked at it because this is the poem that gives our novel its name. So here's a stanza from the very end, or almost the very end, of the poem. But Mousie, thou art no thy lane, in proving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes o' mice and men gang aft agley, and lee us not but grief and pain for promised joy. Again, it's in Scots dialect, so the wording's a little weird compared to our modern English. But if you remember, the point of this poem is that even the best plans can fall apart. The mouse spent so long carefully building its nest, and then the farmer, by accident, mows through it and destroys it in an instant. So this is where the title of the book comes from, and we'll see this idea come through the book, that no matter how well you plan, something can happen that is out of your control and you're left with nothing but grief and pain. That is what the Great Depression is. People who had spent their whole lives building up a career, building up a household, were suddenly left with almost nothing. These are some pictures from the Great Depression from the 1930s, focusing on itinerant workers. You can see families with almost nothing, just trying to hang on. So, to talk a little bit more about migrant workers, back in the 1930s, there was some farm machinery, but much of it was fairly new. A lot of farm work still had to be done by hand, and even when there was farm machinery, it was typically very expensive. So during the Great Depression, farmers could not afford to get new technology. So between the 1880s and the 1930s, where we are looking, thousands of people would travel around the countryside looking for work. There wasn't enough work to go around, so they couldn't just live in one space. They had to keep moving to find where the jobs were, especially with farming, which is seasonal work. There are different needs for farms in the spring versus summer versus fall, and very little need for workers in the winter. These jobs could include harvesting crops, doing odd jobs like digging things out, breaking down rocks, really whatever work was needed. There was a population ready to be paid whatever they could get to do it. And these workers were typically paid very, very poorly because demand was so low. There were so many of them and so few jobs. They would often be paid the equivalent, or they'd often be paid around $2.50 to $3 for every day of work, which is the equivalent of about $50 to $60 today. So they would work a full 9-10 hour day, and they'd be paid maybe $5 an hour if they were lucky, plus food and shelter, but that is still very, very low. During the 1930s, when that employment rate reached 30%, there were so many people looking for work that there were actually agencies set up to match these migrant workers with farms that needed help. We'll see one of these mentioned in the book. Our two main characters, George and Lenny, are given work cards from a place called Murray and Reddy's, which is one of these farm work agencies. So they are basically sent to a particular farm, told, you're going to report here, you're going to do this job, then when the job's done, come back to us, we'll find somewhere else for you to go. The American dream is this concept we'll look at a bit more, but it's the idea that America is the land of opportunity. And for many people, the Great Depression was a reality check that broke this idea of the American dream when people found that their dreams were falling apart around them. Again, the Great Depression affected people worldwide. America is such an important financial power that a stock market crash in America reverberates out, vocab word, and affects other countries. But in particular, Americans, especially lower and middle class people, and especially farmers, were really struggling. To make matters even worse, in the midst of the Great Depression, there was also a natural disaster happening, what was called the Dust Bowl, a series of droughts in the Midwest and in the American prairies that made farmlands fail. So thousands of people during this time left the Midwest and traveled towards California, where the weather was better, the drought wasn't as bad. So not only were there plenty of already unemployed people in California, there were even more people coming from other states with the hopes that California would be better. Our main characters in this book, George and Lenny, have dreams that they hang on to in spite of all this hardship. It's not a big dream. They dream of having a little house and couple of acres that they own, where they can stay and benefit from their own work rather than moving from place to place to work for other people. So last but not least, just to give a more precise idea of the American dream, the common definition is quoted up here. The idea that a hardworking and dedicated person can achieve anything that they want to achieve within the American system. Now, I'm guessing most of you, if not all of you, immediately have the sense that this is not reality, it's wishful thinking. But it was an idea that many people held on to, and it's one that has been challenged again and again. One writer, James Truslow Adams, wrote in 1931 that the American dream was, quote, the dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability or achievement. And if we go all the way back to the Declaration of Independence, they wrote in it, all men are created equal, they have certain unalienable rights, among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that is the American dream, the idea that everyone, regardless of who they are, has these inalienable rights, including the right to happiness, the pursuit of happiness. Doesn't come automatically, but as long as you are willing to put in the work, you can get it. That is the American dream. So one question we'll be looking at as we continue is the American dream possible in the historical context of the novel? Keep this in mind as you finish the first part of your notes for 8.1. You're going to be reading chapter 1 of the book, and then we'll come back and talk a bit more about some themes in the book. I hope you enjoy the start of Mice and Men.